What the lights don't show. The triumph, the tragedy, and the truth about the Empire State Building. The cost we agreed to forget. Prologue. The most famous lie in New York. Every night in Manhattan, the Empire State Building lights up the sky. Pink for breast cancer awareness. Rainbow colors for Pride Month. Red, white, and blue for Independence Day. Green for Earth Day. The building cycles through hundreds of color combinations every year, each one attached to a cause or a celebration or a cultural moment worth acknowledging. The tower glows over Midtown like a civic calendar made of light, reminding the city below that it is still here, still standing, still the most recognizable vertical object in one of the most recognized cities in the world. 4 million people per year pay to ride its elevators. They stand on the observation deck on the 86th floor and look out over the grid, the rivers, the bridges, the parks, the boroughs spreading toward the horizon. They take photographs. They propose marriage. They cry at the view. They post the images and tag their location and carry the memory home with them to wherever they came from. Here is what the lights don't show, what the observation deck doesn't acknowledge, what the $75 ticket price doesn't include. At least 5 workers died during construction, probably more. Their names appear on no plaque inside the building, no memorial in the lobby, no marker anywhere on the 73 floors between the ground and the observation deck they helped build. 14 people died when a U.S. Army bomber flew into the building at 200 miles an hour on a foggy July morning in 1945. The 79th floor where they died was repaired and re-rented within months. There is no acknowledgement of them anywhere visitors might see it. Between 30 and 50 people, the exact number has never been definitively established, have ended their lives by jumping from the building's upper floors or observation deck since it opened in 1931. The metal barriers that ring the observation deck today exist specifically because earlier barriers were not high enough to stop them. The building does not mention this. One visitor was shot and killed on the observation deck in 1997 by a man who had traveled specifically to Manhattan to commit the act. The victim's name is Christopher Burmeister. It appears nowhere in the building. This is the story of the Empire State Building, not the version that appears on the tickets and the postcards and the tourist guides. The full version, the one that includes what happened and who paid for it, and why the building has been so careful to make sure you don't think about any of it while you're standing there admiring the view. Part 1. The Catholic stenographer's son and the monument he needed to build. The Empire State Building was not built because Manhattan needed more office space. Manhattan in 1929 did not need more office space. What it needed, as would become horrifyingly apparent within months of when construction began, was economic stability, which it was about to lose entirely. The building was built because one man needed to prove something. And understanding what he needed to prove requires understanding who he was and where he had come from. John Jacob Raskob was born in 1879 in Lockport, New York, the son of a cigar maker. His father died while he was young. The family fell into poverty. Raskob left school at 15 and took a job as a stenographer, a typist and shorthand writer, one of the more feminized occupations in the clerical economy of the turn of the century, to support his mother and siblings. He earned $12 a week. He was fast and accurate and utterly determined to be something other than what his circumstances suggested he would be. In 1900, he found work as a secretary to Pierre S. DuPont, heir to one of the most powerful chemical fortunes in America. DuPont recognized in the young clerk something that justified promotion, a facility with numbers, an intuitive grasp of how capital could be deployed to multiply itself, and an ambition that operated without visible anxiety. Raskob rose through the DuPont organization with the speed of a man who understood that the only way to move from the bottom to the top was to make himself indispensable to the people already at the top. By 1914, he was treasurer of E.I. DuPont and Amores and Company. The following year, he engineered the DuPont family's major investment in a struggling automobile manufacturer called General Motors. The investment would eventually give DuPont control of approximately 23% of GM stock. Raskob joined the General Motors board and became chairman of its finance committee. As automobile sales exploded across America through the 1920s, his personal fortune grew alongside the company's profits. He invented, or at least popularized, the installment payment plan that made car ownership accessible to the middle class. The buy now, pay later structure that would become one of the defining financial innovations of the 20th century and would eventually generate both extraordinary wealth and extraordinary social consequences. By the late 1920s, John Jacob Raskob, the stenographer's son from Lockport, was one of the most powerful financiers in America. He was also deeply and permanently conscious of the fact that certain doors had remained closed to him despite his wealth. Doors that opened readily for men with different surnames, different religions, and different ancestry. Raskob was a devout Catholic. He was the grandson of immigrants. He had watched the Protestant establishment of American finance regard him with a particular mixture of respect and condescension that powerful institutions reserve for people who have acquired the right credentials, but will never quite be accepted as fully belonging. In 1928, he threw his considerable financial resources behind the presidential campaign of New York Governor Al Smith, a Catholic and anti-prohibition Democrat, and the son of Irish and Italian immigrant parents who embodied everything the Protestant rural establishment of American politics resisted. Raskob became chairman of the Democratic National Committee. He poured money into Smith's campaign with the conviction of a man who had something personal at stake beyond politics. Herbert Hoover crushed Smith in a general election. 40 states went Republican. Smith lost his own home state. The defeat carried an unmistakable religious subtext. Many Americans were simply not prepared to vote for a Catholic president, and they proved it emphatically. After the election, Smith needed employment. He was 54 years old, had served 4 terms as governor, and had lost the only higher office available. Raskob needed a public face for an ambitious real estate project he was already developing. The partnership that emerged from this convergence of mutual need would produce the most famous building in the world, though not for any of the reasons either man intended. Raskob's idea was bold and essentially irrational. He would build the tallest building ever constructed, not because there was demand for the office space it would create, not because the location was underserved, not because the economics suggested a sound investment. He would build it because he needed a monument, a physical argument, made in steel and limestone and rising higher than anything anyone had ever built, that a Catholic stenographer's son from upstate New York could do something that all the old money families in America could not surpass. He would place Al Smith at the project's head. The man whom America had rejected as unworthy of the presidency would oversee the construction of America's most ambitious building. Whether this was consolation or revenge probably depended on the day. Part 2. The competition that consumed common sense. The site Raskob selected carried its own pointed symbolism. The Waldorf Astoria Hotel stood at the corner of 5th Avenue and 34th Street, occupying the entire block. It had been built in the 1890s by the Astor family, old money aristocrats whose fortune traced back to fur trading and Manhattan real estate accumulated across generations of inherited privilege. The Waldorf Astoria represented the Gilded Age establishment in physical form. Its ballrooms hosted society weddings. Its restaurants served the elite. Its guest registers contained the names of everyone who mattered in the world that had been so careful to remind Raskob that he was adjacent to its center, but never quite inside it. To purchase the Waldorf Astoria site and demolish the hotel was to announce something specific. The era of old money aristocracy was finished. New money, Catholic money, immigrant money, the kind of fortune assembled through intelligence and relentless work rather than through inheritance, could now claim the highest ground in Manhattan. Raskob organized a group of investors and formed Empire State Incorporated. He negotiated with the hotel's owners, who were already aware that the Waldorf Astoria had been losing competitive ground to newer hotels farther uptown. The land was worth more than the structure. In August 1929, the deal was finalized. Empire State Incorporated purchased the property for approximately $16 million. The hotel would close. Demolition would begin by year's end. But Raskob faced competition from an unexpected direction, and the competition transformed his monument project into something considerably more expensive and considerably more preposterous. Across town, at 42nd Street and Lexington Avenue, Walter Chrysler was building his own skyscraper. Chrysler was everything Raskob was not in terms of American archetype. Old stock Protestant, self-made through the mechanics of the railroad and automotive industries. a man who had built Chrysler Corporation from the ground up into a serious rival to General Motors. His architect, William Van Allen, was designing a tower with gleaming Art Deco styling and a distinctive crown. The plans for the exact height of the crown were being kept secret. In October 1929, precisely as the stock market was beginning its catastrophic collapse, workers hoisted a 125-foot stainless steel spire in a place inside the Chrysler Building's crown, revealing it to the world only when it was already in position. The Chrysler Building suddenly stood at 1,046 feet, the tallest building in the world. Raskob was not interested in second place. He summoned the architectural firm of Shreve, Lamb, and Harmon. The lead architect, William F. Lamb, was given approximately 2 weeks to produce preliminary designs and was reportedly asked a question that stripped the project of any architectural pretension and reduced it to its essential nature. How high can you make it so it won't fall down? The answer, high enough to clear 1,250 feet, which would provide a comfortable margin over Chrysler's achievement. But Raskob wanted more than height. He wanted height that looked purposeful, or at least height that could be described in terms of purpose. Lamb designed a mooring mast, a dock for dirigibles, that would sit atop the building's main structure. Transatlantic airships could theoretically approach from Europe, attached to the mast, and deliver passengers directly to the heart of Manhattan without requiring them to descend to a conventional airport. The mooring mast added 200 feet to the building's total height. The Empire State Building would now reach 1,454 feet. The Chrysler Building's record would be buried. Dirigible captains immediately and correctly pointed out that the aerodynamics around a 1,454-foot building in Midtown Manhattan made the mooring concept physically impossible. Updrafts created by the building's own mass, combined with the unpredictable wind patterns generated by the surrounding urban canyon, would make any attempt to hold a large airship stationary at the mast height genuinely dangerous. Passengers could never safely disembark. The mast was, from an aviation standpoint, a fantasy. From Raskob's standpoint, it was a solution. The mooring mast made the building taller than the Chrysler Building, and that was its only required function. The height race was won before construction even broke ground. On October 24th, 1929, a date now known as Black Thursday, the stock market began collapsing. By October 29th, Black Tuesday, the crash had become catastrophic. Billions of dollars in paper wealth disappeared in days. Raskob watched his General Motors stock plummet. Within weeks, the fundamental assumptions underlying American economic life, the belief in permanent growth, the confidence in speculation as a path to prosperity, the expectation that the good times were structural rather than cyclical, were being demolished. The Empire State Building had been conceived for a Manhattan economy where office space would be increasingly scarce and prestigious. It was about to be built for an economy where office space would be increasingly abundant and worthless. Raskob could have stopped. The Waldorf Astoria still stood. The purchase could theoretically have been unwound. The announcement of the project had been made, but announcements could be walked back. He did not stop. Possibly he believed the crash was temporary. Possibly his ego could not accommodate retreat. Possibly, and this is the interpretation that his subsequent behavior most strongly supports, he understood that the monument had never been about economics in the first place. It was about proving something, and what needed to be proven did not change because the stock market had collapsed. In December 1929, Al Smith announced the project publicly. The Empire State Building would rise on the site of the Waldorf Astoria. It would be the tallest structure ever built. Smith would serve as president of Empire State Incorporated. For a man who had been refused the presidency of the United States, this was a different kind of legacy, a building instead of an office, a physical fact instead of a historical term. Part 3. The Men Who Built IT and the Ones Who Fell. Demolition of the Waldorf Astoria began on October 1st, 1930. The old hotel came down quickly. Workers salvaged what could be salvaged. Marble, fixtures, ornamental elements that had taken craftsmen years to create. Much was simply destroyed. Within months, the site was cleared to bare earth, and below that, the bedrock, Manhattan's schist foundation, into which Raskob's tower would root itself. Construction officially began on March 17, 1930. St. Patrick's Day. The choice of date was either coincidental or deliberate, given that the project was being championed by Irish Catholic politicians and financed by a Catholic industrialist, probably deliberate. Al Smith presided over the groundbreaking ceremony. Behind him, the Depression was deepening. Banks were failing across the country. Unemployment was climbing toward 25%, and work on the world's tallest building was beginning. The general contractor was Starrett Brothers in Ekin. Paul Starrett had built the Chrysler Building and understood how to construct tall structures quickly. Speed was everything. Every month of construction represented money spent before any rental income could be generated. Starrett assembled a workforce that would peak at 3,400 men, coordinated deliveries with military precision, and established the construction schedule that would become one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of American building. At peak efficiency, the steel frame rose at a rate of 4.5 floors per week. 1 floor per day. Steel arrived from Pittsburgh mills on exact schedules, was delivered directly to the site, and was immediately hoisted to the working level. Nothing sat idle. The building seemed to will itself into existence, which is one way to describe what happened when thousands of men worked under conditions that no modern safety code would permit, on a schedule that left no margin for the kind of care that might have kept some of them alive. The workforce was a cross-section of Depression-era America, with the specific demographic characteristics of a large construction project in early 1930s Manhattan. Irish and Italian and German immigrants predominated in the labor ranks. Among the most skilled and the most celebrated, then as now, were Mohawk ironworkers from the Conowake Reserve near Montreal. The Mohawk had been working on high steel since the 1880s, when a bridge construction project near their reservation introduced members of the community to structural ironwork. The precise reasons why the Mohawk proved exceptionally suited to work at extreme heights have been debated for a century. Cultural conditioning, economic necessity, and the particular training that comes from growing up around men who worked at altitude have all been offered as explanations. What is undisputed is that Mohawk ironworkers became essential to skyscraper construction across North America, and that dozens of them came to work on the Empire State Building. The work that ironworkers performed was genuinely terrifying by any honest description. They walked narrow steel beams hundreds of feet above the streets of Manhattan. They caught red-hot rivets thrown from portable forges, caught them in metal cones, held them with tongs, drove them into place with pneumatic hammers, while standing on structures that moved in the wind. There were no safety harnesses. There were no nets. A fall at any height above the first few floors was a death. Workers were expected to be careful. Workers who showed visible fear were dismissed. By September 1930, 6 months after groundbreaking, the steel framework had reached the 75th floor. By November, it topped out at the 86th floor. The mooring mast was completed the following spring. The pace was extraordinary, and it had consequences that the official narrative of the building's construction has consistently minimized. The official death toll for construction of the Empire State Building is 5 workers. 5 names appear in whatever records were kept and reported. J.L. Smith, a rigger, fell from the 5th floor on September 4th, 1930. A worker named Griffin fell to his death 2 weeks later. Mike Duffy was killed on October 15th, 1930. 2 more deaths followed in the winter months. Construction workers and historians have long believed the real number was higher. The range most commonly cited is 8 to 14. The discrepancy matters for a specific and troubling reason. There is documented evidence that families of workers who died during construction were paid settlements conditioned on their silence. The Empire State Building was a symbol under construction. Negative publicity about worker deaths would damage its prospects and its investors' confidence. An immigrant worker's death on a Manhattan construction site in 1930 generated very little automatic documentation. If the family was paid and the family stayed quiet, there was no particular mechanism by which the death entered the official record. The workers who died were, by definition, people whose absence created the least inconvenience for the project. They were immigrants, some possibly working under assumed names. They had families who depended on whatever settlement could be negotiated in a moment of grief and economic desperation. Their deaths were absorbed into the building's construction costs and forgotten. No plaque in the Empire State Building commemorates them. No marker in the lobby lists their names. The building they died building has never, in its 90-plus years of existence, chosen to acknowledge them. The working conditions for those who survived were brutal by any standard that does not use. The alternative was unemployment during the worst economic crisis in American history as the measure. 12-hour days minimum. Winter cold at 1,000 feet above the street was not merely uncomfortable, but physiologically dangerous. Summer heat on steel beams caused burns. The noise of riveting crews was constant and unrelenting. The sound of pneumatic hammers driving hot bolts into steel echoing across Midtown Manhattan throughout the workday. Men went home physically depleted and returned the next morning to do it again. And yet, and this detail is important for understanding both the building and the era it was built in, the men kept coming. The Empire State Building construction site offered something that much of America in 1930 could not: steady employment at wages that could support a family. The choice was not between a comfortable job and a dangerous one. The choice was between this dangerous job and none at all. That is the context within which the building's construction labor history must be understood. The workers were not reckless. They were not unaware of the risks. They were making the calculation that millions of desperate people make when the alternative to dangerous work is no work. Part 4. The Empty State Building, opening into disaster. The Empire State Building officially opened on May 1st, 1931. President Herbert Hoover pressed a button in Washington, D.C. that symbolically illuminated the building's lights. In New York, Alabama Smith stood at the entrance with investors and dignitaries and reporters. Former Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt attended. Smith smiled for the cameras. His name was on the building. His office would be on the top floor. 80% of the rentable space was vacant. Of approximately 2 million square feet of office space, only 20% had been leased when the building opened. The Depression had been accelerating for 18 months. Companies were not expanding. They were contracting, restructuring, or disappearing entirely. The blue-chip corporations that Raskob had imagined occupying the floors of his monument were laying off workers and abandoning expensive office space, not signing long-term leases in a new skyscraper at the corner of 5th Avenue and 34th Street. The mockery began immediately. Journalists coined the nickname that would follow the building for years, the Empty State Building. Al Smith's last erection, a monument to capitalism's failure. The tallest building in the world, a structure that had cost $40 million to build, stood mostly dark against the Manhattan skyline. Entire floors had no tenants. Windows on upper stories that should have glowed with the light of working offices remained unlit night after night. The investors were facing ruin. Empire State Incorporated had borrowed heavily to finance construction. The mortgage payments were enormous. Rental income was supposed to cover those payments and generate profit. Instead, rental income barely covered operating expenses. The building was hemorrhaging money with the patient consistency of a structure built to last centuries and financed on the assumption that the economy would continue to grow. By 1933, the mortgage was in default. The Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, which held the mortgage, had legal grounds for foreclosure. They chose not to exercise them, a decision driven less by generosity than by the recognition that foreclosing on the world's tallest building during the worst depression in American history would be a public relations catastrophe that served nobody's interests. Better to let Empire State Incorporated struggle along and wait for conditions to improve. Al Smith maintained his office on the 80th floor and showed up for work every day, functioning as a visible symbol of the project's continued respectability. He greeted visitors, gave interviews, defended the building against its critics. What he could not do was change the economics of a building that had been conceived for a market that had ceased to exist before construction was finished. The observation deck became the building's unexpected salvation. Tourists would not rent office space, but they would pay to ride elevators to the 86th floor and look out over the most famous city in the world. The admission fee was $1. Within months of opening, the observation deck was generating more revenue than all the office rentals combined. This was, depending on your perspective, either humiliating or revealing. The tallest office building ever constructed was surviving as a tourist attraction. The monument to corporate ambition and financial power was being kept afloat by families and vacationers who wanted to see Manhattan from above. The building was not performing the function it had been designed to perform. It was performing a function nobody had designed it for. generating revenue in a form that its creators almost certainly would have found embarrassing. Raskob's losses were significant. His stock in Empire State Incorporated was essentially worthless. His reputation as a financial genius had been materially damaged. He had built the world's tallest building at the worst possible moment in the worst possible economic environment. And the monument that was supposed to announce his vision had announced, instead, his catastrophically poor timing. He remained wealthy from his earlier investments, but the Empire State Building was a permanent and very visible stain on a financial legacy that had been built on the reputation for excellent judgment. Smith suffered in a different way. He had never been wealthy. The presidency of Empire State Incorporated was supposed to provide him with financial security and meaningful employment after the end of his political career. Instead, it provided him with a daily reminder that the building bearing his name association was, for most of its first decade, a joke. He showed up because he was not the kind of man who walked away, but showing up required accepting that the world was not treating him well. One piece of technology that Raskob had hoped would provide purpose for the building's absurd height turned out to be, as critics had predicted from the beginning, completely useless. The dirigible mooring mast, the 200-foot spire that had raised the building's total height to 1,454 feet, and that had been offered as a practical justification for what was in reality pure competitive excess, was used exactly once in anything resembling its intended function. On September 16, 1931, a small private blimp approached the mast. The updrafts around the building were exactly as bad as aviation experts had predicted. The blimp managed to attach its nose to the mooring post for approximately 3 minutes. Newspapers that had been delivered up to the blimp from the building's crown blew away in the wind. The passengers in the gondola were too frightened to attempt the transfer to the building. The blimp disconnected and departed. No airship ever made another attempt. The mooring mast stood for the next several decades as a 200-foot monument to the point where ego and engineering had parted company entirely. Part 5. The observation deck and the people who climbed the fence. The observation deck on the 86th floor of the Empire State Building opened to the public in May 1931, simultaneously with the rest of the building. It quickly became the most popular tourist attraction in New York City, more popular on many measures than the Statue of Liberty or Central Park. It also attracted a different kind of visitor. On the morning of February 1st, 1933, a man climbed over the safety fence on the observation deck, stood on the narrow ledge beyond the barrier, was noticed by guards too late, and jumped. His body fell 1,050 feet and crashed through the roof of a building across the street. He was never identified. He became the first person to die by suicide from the Empire State Building. More followed. The building's management installed higher fences and added guards specifically trained to watch for visitors who appeared distressed or behaved in ways that suggested they might be there for a reason other than the view. The enhanced precautions slowed the deaths. They did not stop them. By the end of 1933, 5 people had jumped. The fences were raised again. Guards were made more vigilant. The suicides continued. The symbolism that various observers attached to this pattern was not always the same, but it was unavoidable. The tallest monument to American capitalism, a building conceived during the last years of the boom, completed at the depths of the bust, standing as a daily reminder of the gap between what the country had imagined for itself and what it was actually experiencing, had become a destination for people who had reached the end of their ability to continue. Whether the Empire State Building attracted these visitors because of its height, its accessibility, its fame, or some combination of all three has been debated. What is not debated is that people kept coming. The most famous case arrived on a Thursday afternoon in May 1947. A 23-year-old bookkeeper named Evelyn McHale rode the elevator to the 86th floor. She removed her coat and folded it neatly on the railing. She left her purse. She climbed over the fence and stepped into the air. Evelyn fell 1,050 feet. Her body struck the roof of a United Nations limousine parked on 34th Street. The impact destroyed the car. The effect on her body was, in a physical detail that has baffled and haunted observers for generations, strangely composed. A photography student named Robert Wiles was across the street when he heard the impact. He ran to the scene with his camera. What he found was Evelyn's body lying on the crushed roof of the car with her legs crossed at the ankles. Her right hand resting on her stomach, her eyes closed. She appeared in the photograph that Wiles took and that appeared in Life magazine 11 days later to be sleeping. The image was captioned "The Most Beautiful Suicide." It circulated for decades and continues to circulate. Andy Warhol used it in his work. Artists and philosophers have written about it. The photograph captures something about death and beauty and urban despair that resists easy categorization. Something about the gap between the violent physics of what happened and the peaceful appearance of the result. Evelyn had left a note in her coat pocket. She had written it that morning. She asked that her body not be viewed by her fiancé. She apologized for any inconvenience. She explained that she did not want to be a burden. The note was brief and polite, the kind of writing that suggests someone who has been considering their words carefully. Her fiancé was a college student named Barry Rhodes, studying at Lafayette College in Pennsylvania. They had recently become engaged. Something had broken that engagement or threatened it. The details were never made public. Evelyn McHale was 23 years old and had decided that whatever lay ahead of her was worse than the fall. The building installed yet higher fences with inward angling barriers after her death. The suicides continued. The barriers became more elaborate. The observation deck acquired the appearance, to anyone who thought about it carefully, of a place that had been hardened specifically against the intention of certain visitors. By the time metal detectors and bag searches were installed after the 1997 shooting, the observation deck security architecture had accumulated decades of modifications driven entirely by the need to prevent people from using the building to end their lives. The total number of suicides from the Empire State Building has never been definitively established. The building's management had no incentive to publicize them. Each death that received press coverage potentially discouraged future visitors from the revenue-generating observation deck. Police filed reports. Newspapers sometimes mentioned incidents briefly. Families of those who died generally preferred silence, both because suicide carried social stigma and because they had enough grief without seeing their loss become public property. Estimates of the total number range from 30 to 50 deaths, spanning the years from 1931 to the present. That range, which acknowledges the genuine uncertainty in the historical record, represents a number of human beings who were in distress severe enough that they traveled to a specific location, paid an admission fee, waited in line, rode an elevator, and climbed a barrier specifically designed to stop them. The Empire State Building is many things simultaneously. One of them is this. The observation deck does not mention it. Part 6. The morning the bomber came through the fog. July 28, 1945. A Saturday morning. Fog blanketed Manhattan so completely that visibility from the upper floors of tall buildings was effectively zero. Lieutenant Colonel William Franklin Smith Jr. was an experienced Army Air Forces pilot with over 1,000 log flight hours. He was flying a B-25 Mitchell medium bomber, a twin-engine aircraft that weighed approximately 18,000 pounds at flight weight from Bedford, Massachusetts to Newark Airport in New Jersey. Two other men were aboard. Staff Sergeant Christopher Dimitrovich, acting as co-pilot, and Albert Perna, a Navy machinist who was hitching a ride back to base. Smith should not have been in the air. The weather conditions over New York that morning were well below the minimums required for visual flight rules, the regulations that governed flight based on pilot visibility rather than instrument navigation. When Smith contacted the control tower at LaGuardia Field, he was told that visibility was less than 3 miles. He replied that he was bound for Newark. The controller cleared him to proceed, but advised caution. Smith descended into the fog. What happened over the next few minutes is reconstructed from radar data, survivor accounts, and the physical evidence of the crash site. The B-25 descended through the cloud cover and emerged into the narrow band of clearer air between the fog base and street level, flying north up 5th Avenue at approximately 900 feet altitude. Office workers in buildings along the avenue looked out their windows and saw the plane appear between the buildings. Impossibly low, impossibly close, moving fast. The Empire State Building rose to 1,454 feet. Smith was below the building's summit and flying directly toward it. He pulled up. Not enough. At 9:40 in the morning, the B-25 struck the north face of the Empire State Building between the 78th and 79th floors. The impact created a hole 18 feet wide and 20 feet tall. The plane's wings sheared off against the building's exterior. The fuselage punched through the outer wall and drove deep into the interior. One of the engines tore through the building entirely, emerging from the south side and crashing through the roof of a 12-story building on 33rd Street, where it started a fire. The second engine and part of the landing gear crashed into an elevator shaft. The plane's fuel tanks ruptured on impact. 1,000 gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline ignited. A fireball erupted from the north face of the building. Flames shot out of windows on the 79th floor. Black smoke poured into the Manhattan sky. Debris, pieces of aircraft, chunks of limestone, shards of glass, pages of documents, fragments of office furniture rained down on the street below. People on the sidewalks ran. All three men aboard the bomber died instantly. Lieutenant Colonel Smith was thrown through the aircraft's windscreen and into the building. His body was recovered from an elevator shaft. Staff Sergeant Dimitrovich and Albert Perna were killed in the initial impact, and their remains were recovered from the wreckage over the following days. Inside the building, on the 79th floor, the workers had no warning whatsoever. The Catholic War Relief Services maintained offices on that floor. 11 employees were at work on a Saturday morning. The impact killed 10 of them instantly. The explosion incinerated some. Others were crushed by debris or thrown through windows by the blast. The 11th died later from burns and injuries. On the 80th floor, directly above the impact, workers felt the building shudder and saw smoke begin rising through the floor. Some thought a boiler had exploded. Others understood immediately that something had struck the building. They evacuated down the staircases, since the elevators had been taken offline by the crash. Betty Lou Oliver was a 20-year-old elevator operator working in the building that morning. She had been operating a car on a lower floor when the plane hit. The impact threw her from her elevator car. She suffered severe burns and a broken back. When rescue workers found her, they placed her in a different elevator car to take her down to the lobby where ambulances were waiting. They did not know that the crash had damaged cables in that shaft. The elevator descended normally for a few floors. Then the cables failed. The car went into free fall. Betty Lou Oliver dropped 75 floors. The car crashed into the basement. The emergency braking system did not engage. By rights, she should have died. She did not. The bottom of the shaft had filled with water from broken pipes. The severed cables had coiled at the base, creating a crude and accidental cushion. Rescue workers found her alive in the wreckage, conscious, critically injured, but breathing. She had survived a fall that no engineering specification for elevator emergency systems had been designed to accommodate. Betty Lou Oliver's survival remains the longest survived elevator fall in recorded history. She would spend months recovering in the hospital. The fire burned for 40 minutes. Firefighters faced the challenge of fighting a blaze on the 79th floor with inadequate water pressure at that height. Hoses had to be connected to standpipes, and equipment had to be hauled laboriously up stairwells while smoke filled the upper floors. By 10:30 in the morning, the fire was under control. The structure had held. The steel frame of the Empire State Building had absorbed the kinetic energy of an 18,000-pound aircraft traveling at 200 miles per hour and had not failed. 14 people died. The 3 men aboard the aircraft. 11 workers in the building. Their bodies were removed over the following days. Families were notified. Funerals were held. The Empire State Building reopened for business on Monday, July 30th, 1945, 48 hours after the crash. Repairs to the damaged floors would take months, but the rest of the building was operational. Tenants returned to work. The elevators resumed service. Within weeks, even the observation deck was back in operation. The crash received extensive press coverage. Photographs of the burning building appeared on front pages across the country. Newsreel footage documented the damage. And then, 11 days after the crash, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 14 dead in Manhattan became a historical footnote. The building that had been struck by a military aircraft and survived was briefly famous for the fact of its survival. The people who had not survived were a secondary detail. The accident also altered aviation regulation in ways that were necessary, but came too late for 14 people. Pilots flying under visual flight rules were given clearer guidance about minimum visibility requirements over urban areas. Air traffic controllers were instructed to decline clearance when conditions were unsafe rather than issuing caution advisories that left the judgment to the pilot. These changes were genuine improvements to aviation safety that have almost certainly saved lives in the decades since. Lieutenant Colonel Smith, who could not be disciplined because he was dead, had inadvertently improved the system that failed to stop him. There is no plaque on the 79th floor where they died. There is no memorial anywhere in the building that acknowledges the crash or names its victims. The floors were repaired, re-rented, and returned to the ordinary commercial life of the building. The crash is mentioned in the building's history in the same way that remarkable coincidences are mentioned, as evidence of the building's extraordinary durability. The dead are not mentioned at all. Part 7, From Failure to Icon, How the Building Reinvented Itself. The building finally became profitable in 1950, 19 years after it opened. By that point, the Depression was history, the war was history, and the sustained economic expansion that would define the post-war American experience had already been running for 5 years. Occupancy climbed. The federal government had leased multiple floors for war-related offices during the conflict, and some of those agencies had stayed. Other tenants followed. By 1941, as the country mobilized for war, the building was approximately 75% occupied. The government's wartime demand for office space had done what the private market had been unable to do: fill a building that had been conceived for a boom economy and opened into a collapse. The irony was consistent with everything else about the Empire State Building's history. The monument to American capitalism survived the Depression not through market forces, but through federal expenditure. The transformation from embarrassment to icon had begun years earlier, through a channel that nobody associated with John Jacob Raskob's vision of corporate prestige. In 1933, RKO Pictures released King Kong. The film follows a giant ape, captured on a remote island, transported to New York City as a commercial attraction, and eventually driven to the top of the Empire State Building by terror and the pursuing biplanes, to its death on the building's crown. The film was a massive commercial success. It embedded the Empire State Building's silhouette in the imagination of millions of Americans who might never visit New York. The building became a character in popular culture in a way that genuine fame requires. Not merely recognized, but narratively necessary, the kind of structure around which stories naturally organize themselves. Children across America who had never been to New York knew the Empire State Building's shape from King Kong. They knew the Art Deco crown, the setback profile, the mooring mast where the fictional ape made his final stand. The building's failure as an office building investment was becoming irrelevant to its success as a symbol. Symbols do not need to generate rental income. Through the 1930s and 1940s, the building became home to broadcasting. Radio and television companies installed antennas on the mooring mast that had never hosted a dirigible. The height that Raskob had pursued for ego now served a genuinely practical purpose. Signals broadcast from 1,454 feet could reach millions of homes across the metropolitan area. Broadcasters paid meaningful rent for antenna space. The mooring mast finally found a function. The tenant roster gradually improved. Law firms opened offices. Financial services companies moved in. Publishing houses, advertising agencies, and professional services firms established themselves. The building was becoming a respectable address. Not the most prestigious in Manhattan, but solid and recognized. The kind of place where a successful company could locate without embarrassment and with the added benefit of an address that everyone in the world knew. Al Smith remained in his office until his death on October 4th, 1944. He had been president of Empire State, Incorporated for 13 years. He had watched the building struggle through the Depression and begin its recovery during the war. He did not live to see it achieve genuine profitability. He died of heart failure and lung complications at the age of 70, remembered as a progressive governor and a champion of the urban immigrant working class. The Empire State Building appeared in his obituaries as his final project. By 1944, it was no longer the joke it had been. Smith had lasted longer than the mockery. John Jacob Raskob outlived him by 6 years, dying in October 1950 at his estate in Maryland. The investment had been financially catastrophic for most of the people who had financed it. The original investors were wiped out. Empire State Incorporated had restructured its debt multiple times. The Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, which had held the mortgage through the worst years, had effectively controlled the building for extended periods. The men who had imagined the project and financed it died, having recovered nothing from the investment. The men who had acquired control through the wreckage, however, did very well. Roger Stevens and a group of investors purchased the building in 1951 for $51 million. In 1961, a complex transaction brought Lawrence Veen and Peter Malkin into control. The Malkin family would hold their position for decades. The building that had cost its original investors everything became worth, by 2006, approximately $2 billion. By 2013, when Empire State Realty Trust went public through an initial public offering, the building was valued at roughly $2.5 billion. The pattern is stark and consistent. Those who built the Empire State Building received nothing. Those who died building it were forgotten. Those who financed it were ruined. Those who envisioned it saw it become a symbol of their failure before they could witness its redemption. And those who arrived after the worst was over, who simply held the asset through the decades of appreciation, became extraordinarily wealthy. The building rewards patience, not vision. It rewarded the people who came after, not the people who created it. This is perhaps the most honest thing about the Empire State Building. It is a monument that consumed those who made it and enriched those who inherited it. The building's resilience through the Depression years taught a lesson that subsequent owners absorbed thoroughly. The Empire State Building's value was not primarily financial in the conventional real estate sense. It was cultural. It was symbolic. It was the kind of value that could not be accurately priced on a balance sheet because it derived from the building's presence in the collective imagination rather than from its square footage or its rental income. This insight, which was not available to the men who financed construction in 1929 and lost everything, became the foundation on which later owners built extraordinary wealth. The broadcasting revenues that began flowing in the 1930s and accelerated through the television age were a concrete expression of this symbolic value. Broadcasting companies did not pay to place antennas on the Empire State Building because it offered the highest elevation in the New York metropolitan area. By the time major television networks were establishing themselves, taller structures were available or could be built. They paid because broadcasting from the Empire State Building carried a cachet that no other address could provide. The building's fame was a commercial asset independent of its physical properties. Raskob had understood this intuitively when he conceived the project. He simply miscalculated how long it would take for the cultural value to translate into financial returns. Part 8. The violence that keeps coming and the silence that follows. In 1976, the building's owners installed colored floodlights capable of illuminating the tower's upper stories in different combinations. The lighting system, which has since been updated and expanded multiple times, allows the building to mark holidays, cultural celebrations, charitable causes, and civic occasions in a visual language visible for miles. Red, white, and blue for Independence Day. Green for Earth Day. Pink for breast cancer awareness. Rainbow colors for pride. The building lights itself for hundreds of different occasions each year. It is never lit to commemorate the workers who died during its construction. It is never lit in memory of the 14 people killed when the bomber struck the 79th floor. It is never lit for the suicide victims. These are choices. The building's owners choose what to illuminate and what to leave dark. On February 23, 1997, a 69-year-old man named Ali Abu Kamal rode the elevator to the 86th floor observation deck at approximately 5 o'clock in the afternoon. He was carrying a .380 caliber semi-automatic pistol. He walked among the tourists for a few minutes without attracting attention. Then he opened fire. He shot 7 people. One of them, a 27-year-old Danish musician named Christopher Burmeister, who was visiting New York with a friend, died from his wounds. 6 others were injured, several critically. After shooting the victims, Kamal turned the gun on himself. He was dead when police reached him. Witnesses reported that Kamal had appeared calm before the shooting. He had not shouted, had made no statement, had not identified himself or his intentions. He had simply stood among tourists on the observation deck of the world's most famous building and started killing people. Investigators found letters in his belongings that suggested he blamed the United States for personal and financial difficulties that had accumulated over years. The evidence indicated that the attack had been planned, not impulsive. Kamal had traveled to New York specifically for this purpose. He had purchased his weapon legally. Nothing in his background had flagged him as a threat. He was an elderly man with no criminal record who had decided to kill strangers at the top of America's most recognized building. The observation deck was closed while authorities processed the scene. It reopened after metal detectors and bag screening were installed. Security measures that had been proposed in previous years and resisted by management as excessive and unwelcoming. The shooting ended that resistance. Every visitor to the observation deck would now pass through airport-style security screening. Christopher Burmeister was buried in Denmark. His family mourned. His name does not appear anywhere in the Empire State Building. The observation deck sells approximately 4 million tickets per year. Admission ranges from $40 to $75 depending on the floor and whether visitors pay extra for expedited access. The building generates more revenue from tourism than from office space. The observation deck is a machine for producing tourist experiences and the income those experiences generate. Memorializing the people who died there would not serve that function. This calculation is not unusual. It is not specific to the Empire State Building. It is how commercial landmarks manage the relationship between their history and their revenue. The dark chapters are edited from the standard narrative. The deaths are absorbed and left behind. The building moves forward with the aspects of its story that attract visitors rather than deter them. What makes the Empire State Building's version of this calculation particularly visible is the cumulative weight of what has been edited. At least 5 construction workers, 14 victims of the 1945 crash, 1 shooting victim, between 30 and 50 suicide deaths. The specific number is unverifiable, which is itself a form of erasure. The building's history contains deaths whose count cannot be established because they were not systematically recorded, which in turn reflects the consistent priority given to the building's reputation over the lives of the people who died in it. This is not an accusation that requires a villain. The people who made these decisions were operating within the norms of their times. Construction fatalities during the Depression were standard-issue tragedies, absorbed without much ceremony into the cost accounting of large projects. The crash victims were honored in the way that 1945 honored war-adjacent casualties, briefly, with appropriate grief before the next news cycle arrived. Suicide victims were handled with the discretion that the era expected and that families requested. The shooting victim's family received what condolences were appropriate. The argument is not that anyone behaved with unusual callousness. The argument is that the pattern of what gets commemorated and what gets forgotten reveals something about the values that organize that pattern. The Empire State Building lights itself every night for causes and celebrations and cultural moments it has decided merit public acknowledgement. It has never, in 90-plus years, lit itself for the people who died building it or operating it or visiting it. That is a choice. And like all choices, it says something. Epilogue, the triumph we celebrate and what we chose to forget. The Empire State Building will almost certainly stand for another century. The steel skeleton driven into Manhattan's schist bedrock in 1930 shows no sign of failing. The Art Deco facade, cleaned, repaired, maintained with the sustained investment that a building generating billions in value can now afford, remains as striking as it was when the building opened into an empty Depression-era skyline. The building has survived everything it has encountered. Economic catastrophe, a world war, a plane crash, decades of near bankruptcy followed by extraordinary appreciation. The collapse of the World Trade Center towers on September 11, 2001, which briefly restored the Empire State Building status as the tallest structure in Manhattan by default. An uncomfortable distinction that the building had not sought and that arrived through the deaths of 3,000 people. The building absorbed all of it and continued. The $550 million energy efficiency renovation completed between 2009 and 2013 retrofitted the building systems for the 21st century while preserving the exterior and public spaces that a National Historic Landmark designation in 1986 had mandated be protected. New windows, upgraded heating and cooling systems, improved insulation. The building that Starrett Brothers had constructed in 14 months at a pace of 4 floors per week was now operating with considerably less energy than when it was built, while looking almost identical from the outside. The observation deck has expanded to include the 102nd floor, the second higher vantage point for visitors willing to pay an additional premium. The ticket lines on peak days can require hours of waiting. The experience has been carefully designed to maximize both revenue and the sense of participating in something historically significant. It succeeds at both. What the experience is less designed to do is tell the complete story. The guided audio tours describe the construction. They mention the speed record. They discuss Raskob and Al Smith in the Depression-era context. They do not name the workers who died. They do not linger at the location of the 1945 crash. They do not explain why the observation deck barriers are designed the way they are. These omissions are not conspiracies. They are ordinary commercial decisions made by people who understand that the story visitors want to hear is the triumph, not the cost. That the monument they have paid to visit should feel like an achievement, not a reckoning. That the view from the 86th floor should produce wonder and not grief. But there is another version of the same visit, one in which the wonder and the grief coexist. One in which you stand at the observation deck barrier, the one with the inward angling top that was designed specifically to prevent climbing and understand why it looks the way it does. One in which you look at the 79th floor and know who died there and why no plaque marks the spot. One in which you know the names, or as many of the names as the records preserve, of the men who fell during construction and whose families were paid to stay quiet about it. The renovation completed in 2013 also represented something important about how the building had come to understand its own nature. The decision to invest $550 million in energy efficiency, a sum that exceeded the building's original construction cost in nominal terms, reflected the recognition that the Empire State Building was not merely a commercial property that happened to be famous. It was a permanent institution with an indefinite future, an asset whose value derived precisely from its persistence and its continuity. You maintain institutions differently from properties. You invest in their longevity, not because the return is calculable in the short term, but because the institution's continued existence is the asset, and everything else follows from that. The Empire State Building is, in that more complete version of its own story, a richer and more honest monument than the officially curated version allows it to be. It is a monument to American ambition and American resilience and American ingenuity, all of which are real and worth celebrating. It is also a monument to what American ambition and American resilience and American ingenuity have consistently chosen to overlook. The workers who don't get plaques, the victims who don't get memorial floors, the desperate visitors who don't get mentioned in the audio tour. Every night, the lights come on. The building announces itself to the city below, glowing in whatever color has been assigned to whatever cause or celebration is being recognized that evening. The colored lights are beautiful. They're a genuine civic gesture, a building participating in the life of the city it defines. What they light up is the triumph. The victory of the building over the Depression, over the bombers, over the skeptics who called it Burnham's folly and Al Smith's last erection and the empty state building. The monument endures. The monument prevails. What they don't illuminate is the cost. The names that don't appear on plaques. The floors that were repaired and re-rented without ceremony. The barriers that are there for reasons the building prefers not to discuss. That is a choice the building makes every night when the lights come on. And it is, if you're paying attention, as much a part of the building's story as the colored lights themselves. The Empire State Building has won. It always wins. That is what monuments do. The question is whether winning requires forgetting, or whether a monument that told its full story would be, in the end, more worth celebrating than one that only shows you the parts it has decided you should see.